Reformation Fellowship provides support and fellowship to all who would stand for the reformation of Christ's church worldwide. We long to see the church revitalized by the gospel and seek to encourage all who share that vision. We gather together for gospel-hearted fellowship around gospel-minded theology. We are a ministry of union. Greetings and welcome back to the Reformation Fellowship Podcast. I am your host, Justin Schell, and we are so glad that you have joined us. It's our prayer that your time with us causes you to delight in God, to grow in Christ, to serve the church, and bless the world. And so we're praying for you. We're glad you've joined us today. And our conversation is with Paul Spear. Paul is the Pastoral Dean at Union School of Theology. This is actually conversation three out of three. So it's our final conversation with Paul, at least for this visit. And we've been covering all things pastorate, right? And we're going to continue that today. Today, we're going to be talking about, we've titled this episode, Pastor, How Are You Doing? And so we're going to be talking about pastoral health. And who better to talk to than the Pastoral Dean of Union School of Theology? Paul, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Justin. It's lovely to be here again.
Yes, and today we are giving our attention not to the work of the pastor, but to the heart of the pastor in many ways. Set the stage for us. What are you hearing from pastors these days about their own health, whether that's physical, emotional, spiritual? What's the state of the pastorate these days?
Yeah, again, I can only speak from my experience. Perhaps to give a very recent example of a brother I've been chatting to, younger man I've been trying to encourage. He suffered, I would say he probably still does suffer from depression. He had a very serious bout of depression a year or two ago that was caused by a very specific circumstance. And I think that's illustrative of a couple of things. First of all, he was willing to talk about it, and I think there is a greater willingness these days to acknowledge things like stress and anxiety and depression. I don't know how common this still is, but I can remember someone saying, it was actually from a pulpit 20-odd years ago, that depression is sin. And I think to myself, I simply don't agree with that. If anyone out there thinks that, and you can show me a biblical case for that, I'll be very interested, but I don't think you can. So this brother was saying that he's willing to speak about it. He felt free to speak about it. But he did feel slightly awkward speaking about it because he's a leader in a church. And so that does raise issues of, where's the joy? So I think there's a greater willingness to talk about these things, which is positive. I think we have to be careful about picking up too much of the cultural problem of the sort of, I define myself by being a victim. I define myself by my weaknesses. I think that there's a difference between being very willing and open and honest and about almost turning it into some sort of strange virtue almost. So we must be a little bit cautious about that. That's not the subject I want to do. I'm not actually going to open that can of worms today. But as long as we're a little bit cautious about and aware of how culture can impinge on this. So people are willing to talk about these things. I think some other conversations I've had more recently, there is a weariness in ministry. There's a certain level of bemusement, feeling puzzled at the sheer speed at which some aspects of culture have run over us. I don't think, we were well prepared for the way culture has gone, even though, you might argue that people like Schaeffer were warning us about this 30 or more years ago. I think the whole equalities agenda that has hit the church, quite apart from the various moral and ethical challenges that we face. So I think people are feeling weary and puzzled as well. So those are some of my first thoughts and observations in answer to that question.
Yeah. And as you look at it and you think about the last 10, 20, 30 years, are things going better now? Are they harder? What's changed in your mind? You mentioned some complexity and with the culture. Anything else that's maybe different than what it would have been, say, 20, 30 years ago?
So I was converted how long ago? 35 years ago now, a bit more. And I think it was easier to be a Christian in terms of people thought you were a bit weird, but you weren't a complete lunatic. People would say, "Oh, well, that's nice for you. I just don't have that sort of faith," and you'll get that sort of response. One of the most annoying responses to evangelism, I always think, "That's nice for you." Well, thank you very much. It can be nice for you too. But I think there's more sense of, you're not just a bit odd. You've made a really bad choice. You're now one of the bad guys. You see that, say pastors, it always used to be that the pastor was the sort of person you want to be there for, your marriages and your funerals, and christenings. If you're a Peter Baptist, sort of cultural Peter Baptist, you would want the pastor there who's an acceptable person to have around. That is going away to some extent, or to a great extent, I think. The way culture views churches, people are quite cautious. One of the things I've observed, again, my last job, part of that was helping churches with practical things. It was other people doing it. It was the lawyer and the accountant who were doing it, but I was overseeing that. And just the same is finding that schools and colleges and local community centres weren't very keen. It used to be that if you had a church using your building as a school, well, you've ticked the community engagement box and earned some money. So win-win all round. Right. Whereas now you're finding schools, saying, no, unless you can sign our equality statement, we don't want you. We don't want to be associated with you. I think that's a developing reality. I don't want to over dramatize that, or compare it to other places in the world where I don't want to call this a sort of persecution when I know that there are brothers and sisters out there who are wandering around having lost their houses. But I think it has got worse. Yeah. There's an opportunity in that, of course, because with the decline of a kind of cultural Christianity, now that does have some bad effects on society, I believe. But actually, in terms of evangelism, it's much more obvious, who's a believer and who isn't. Yeah. And I think churches need to really, with the appropriate humility and certainly not a holier than thou attitude, I think we want to live that life of consistency and help our church members to understand that will come with a cost. Anyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will face persecution. That's just a truth. So I think those are some of the things that the way in which culture has changed. The acceptance of the gospel has changed, and I think that probably has brought some extra stresses and strains and weariness to those in the ministry, because the responsibility for that does feel as though it does make weighs quite heavily, and with the complex questions that people are asking now around gender identity is the big thing now. These things don't have short answers. Well, I suppose in one way they do have short answers, right. But actually, when you're trying to explain it in a winsome and clear way, and help your church members to be able to do that when they head off into the workplace on a Monday morning, that comes with a certain amount of challenge, I think.
Yeah. So externally, the pastor is now not just a cultural oddity. Maybe in the past he was thought a little out of step with the modern world, but now he is a bad person. He is evil, and they're dealing with that. Would you say internally within the church have things changed? You mentioned in the previous conversation that idea of authority, and because of our culture, even within the church, to be able to have healthy expressions of authority has gotten more difficult. Would that be an internal pressure, or are there other things?
I think that, yes, the whole authority question is a big one, and you've always wanted to lead with gentleness and respect. You always wanted to have the shepherd who's the one who cares for the flock, and you fight the wolves, not your flock.
Right.
That's always been there. I think there is a danger that there is a lack of respect, and then, or as I mentioned in a previous conversation, that can pop out in wrong sort of authoritarian ways. So that is a pressure on pastors. I think one of the other things that's a pressure on pastors is the whole kind of success-based theology that I think is around quite a lot. That if you don't look successful, then you're not successful, and funnily enough, that manifests itself in reverse as well. So some people almost take it to the other extreme. Well, I must be being faithful. There's only 7 of us. No, there's 7 of us because you're not very good at preaching and you don't care for your flock, and you've allowed rows to happen. So a lot of these things have their opposite. Yeah, there are many pressures on pastors. I'm sure it's always been. I'm always a bit cautious about having the sort of it was better or worse in the old days sort of caricature. Right. I think every generation or half generation does have its own challenges, but I think it's undeniable that there's been a speed of change in culture that can't have happened too often across history. I'm not a great history student really, but I can't imagine that it did. Maybe the early days of the Industrial Revolution, I don't know, with the massive urbanization. Again, that's just that's speculative rather than definitive.
Yeah. Well, to this point, we've kind of tried to describe the problem, describe the challenges, and maybe the struggles for pastors. Where can we turn to for help? So I'm really enjoying these days when I have a biblical question or I'm struggling with some type of practical issue in my faith, turning to church history. And I wonder if you could help us. Are there some in church history who could help us? I hesitate to call them heroes of the faith. Maybe fellow strugglers in the faith would be good, but that we could look to that help us struggle today.
I think it's good to just to make a general point that it's good to read histories. It's good to read biographies. I think it's good to read biographies of people who have run the race. And now with the Lord, I had a friend who said, "I never read a book by a person who isn't dead." He said that jokingly, but his point was, I want to read the books of the people who were faithful to the end. So that's a good reason for reading history.
Yeah.
Who would you look at? Some of my heroes would be Spurgeon, and I think he's often he comes across as a very sort of outward going, larger than life character, when you read his sermons, and especially when you read the history, that he was able to project his voice, in a way that is possibly a lost art these days. And you read those sermons, and they are, there's a warmth, there's an engagement, there's a use of language that is, he's someone who is, you could really understand why he could be popular to listen to, and I think he was concerned sometimes that people were just coming to have their ears tickled, which, of course, when you see the content, you kind of think, well, people were just missing the point, weren't they? But then when you realise that he often had to find time to convalesce, really, that he was exhausted on a Monday, that he would travel to the continent because he was feeling quite low at times. I think, and it's amazing the number of people that you read about that had similar sort of ideas of melancholy. I think Charles Wesley was someone who I think was known for that. You look at some great, some wonderful missionaries. You think of someone like C.T. Studd, who, this guy who was an international sports person originally in the UK, and yet he went out and lived sacrificially and simply, and you can find a lot of honesty in those books, and I almost think if there isn't an honesty of the fact that they struggled as well, I suspect those books aren't really the sort of biographies you want to read. So reading widely is a good idea. I do think, actually, as well, have a look at some real life heroes. I can just think, in my time as a Christian, I've often had one or two men who I looked to, who were older mentors, either sort of unofficially, or in one or two cases I've actually asked them to be that, and I chose them to be mentors because I have seen them. I admire them for their ministry, for some fruitfulness, but also for their honesty and willingness to share honestly about some of the struggles. And actually, I'm sort of older than I was, obviously, as everybody is, and some of those brothers who have been mentors for quite a long time, they are now entering that stage of old age, of one dear brother whose wife is suffering from quite severe dementia, and the challenges that is, and look at those heroes and how they're remaining faithful. I think there is a great power in following the example of others. So I would just throw that in as well as some of those famous folk that have books written about them. I don't think there's going to be books written about any of my mentors, but they've helped me hugely, both consciously and unconsciously.
How about churches? How can our churches, whether that's staff, lay leaders, elder boards, presbyteries, etc., be aware of and maybe start to be more helpful when it comes to pastoral health?
I think they need to inform themselves to understand a bit more about what the ministry is like. I'm always a little bit cautious about the idea that the ministry is the hardest job in the world. I think there's lots of people I look at, who go out working in the real world and go into an office of 100 people and they're the only Christian. I was very reluctant to say that my life was more difficult than theirs. I don't think it was. Yeah. I think what elders and deacons and churches need to realize is that it does come with particular pressures. I used the phrase, it's not necessarily more difficult than other jobs, but it's stretched in an unusual way. You know, the hours are a bit strange, to say the least, because you're kind of never really off duty, especially if you live close to the chapel. And you know, or just, you know, walking your children to school, or popping to the local shop. You never know who you're going to meet, or who's watching you. You know, you know, hopefully you're not going to be too grumpy anyway. But there is a certain, well, let me at least. I'm going out into the real world. I'm going to meet people. Let me try and commend Christ by the way I behave. So I think for churches to understand that they do have a particular stress, particular difficulties, particular challenges, and for pastors to be very, very honest about that as well. I would often advocate having some sort of annual review. Now that can sound like a rather sort of worldly, the sort of thing you do in your everyday job. But as long as it's done in a spiritual way, and probably not just the paid pastor, maybe every elder should have a once a year review. How are you doing in your life and ministry? That sort of honest talk. That's a really useful thing to do. Many years ago, the deacons in particular in the church I was at, they asked me, we don't really understand your job, Paul. Can you sort of help us explain it? So I basically I divided my day up into 1 hour slots, just printed out a grid, and I just every hour I just stopped and just scribbled very briefly what I've done in the last hour. It's actually quite an enlightening thing for me. It made me realised how much time I waste. But I then showed it to the deacons, and they said, "Oh right, we see that what the balance of your week is like, particularly the sort of different rhythms of it." You know, in the church I was in, no one wanted me to do a pastoral visit after about 3:30 in the afternoon. Half past 3 till 6 o'clock was a bit of a strange time. I always used to think, but then almost every evening there was a meeting to go to, or a club to help out at, and it was almost like working a split shift. And actually the deacons really appreciated seeing what it was like. So I think just some proactive conversations to help people understand. And then, you know, you can do it in reverse again. You know, help me to understand your job. Help me, the pastor should ask, you know, what's it like, you know, having an hour and a half commute every day, beginning and end of the day. You know, because most pastors live close to the chapel. That mutual understanding, I think, is quite an important thing in ministry.
Yeah, I had a brother just a couple of days ago remark that he had his board was doing one of these annual reviews for him, and the first two of them or so, he felt very defensive. He felt attacked, and he said it was only after, I think they called it, the chairman met with him after the second or third one and just said, "Hey, we don't do this to attack you. We do this to help you. If we don't ask these questions, we don't know what you need input on. We don't know what you need your hands strengthened for. We can't help you. And so we really do this for your good. We're not trying to control. Your job's not in trouble at all." And he said from that point on, he looked forward to these meetings. He could go and say, "Hey guys, here's what I need your input on this time. Here's some of the things that I'm really struggling with." It became a real fruitful practice for him. So I think that's a great idea. Let's say I'm a pastor. I'm busy. Got a lot of things that I'm juggling, but I'm starting to realize I need to slow down, make some changes. I'm starting to see cracks in my armor. What advice would you give to me as I'm just coming to that realization?
Yeah, well, don't live it alone, and don't just tell your wife either. You should tell your wife, but don't just tell your wife. I think make that known. Develop that really good open relationship with your fellow elders, so that you can just share very honestly. I think taking a good hard look at the biblical principles of the Sabbath and how that applies to a pastor. I've often wondered, it's not quite the same as I have a day off in lieu of Sunday. You should have a day off. But what are you going to do with that day off? Well, part of the Sabbath principle, you have to tease out little bits of it, is doing something that isn't work. Now, is ministry work? Well, of course it is. It's a calling, it's a blessing, it's a privilege, but it is also work. To do something completely different is good. Some headspace. Get your church to agree and inform the members that on a Monday you don't phone the pastor. Emergencies, yes, of course. Or actually, there was I had a system where on a day off, there was someone else they could call, and they could then call me. They kind of filtered it out. Is this a real emergency? Because the pastor really wants to know, but I don't always need to know. So just have some thinking about sort of what that day off would look like, and then think about, well, how can it be also spiritually refreshing? And that kind of depends on where you are and whether you like listening to sermons online or whatever that might look like. But just tease out some of those Sabbath principles. Give yourself a little bit of give yourself a little theological a challenge of what does the Sabbath mean to me? And then realize, of course, that Sabbath principle, again, even if you're just pulling out principles from the Old Testament, there are seasons and there are times when you do need to rest. Yes, working well and working thoughtfully and working hard is a good thing, but you also need rest, and you need to sort of separate out that rest. There's a quote from Hudson Taylor, one of the people I turn to to read about. One of his phrases was an hour of work and an hour of rest is better than 3 hours trying to do both. And I thought that's quite interesting. That's a good way of thinking about it. And again, that's just a specific way of thinking about rest. Take some advice on how organized you are. Sometimes pastors get themselves into a muddle because they're not very well organized, and that's not a good thing. It's almost become a sort of jokey, ha ha ha, I'm not a very organized person. Sorry, not acceptable. Doesn't mean you have to be, a real sort of regimented sort of person, but you do need to have, take some advice, do some reading around how to organize your life, how to have a weekly plan. The things like that are just quite helpful. Again, it's around knowing yourself and how the Lord has made you specifically, but it's good to be organized. You don't want stress to be caused because you live a chaotic life. I really don't think that's a good thing for anyone, actually, but especially not a pastor.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Before we wrap up this episode, are there resources that you might recommend for pastoral health? You've mentioned Sabbath. You've mentioned the depression. Are there any resources related to this conversation that you might recommend?
Yes, there's a few books that I would point us to. The books by Paul Tripp are always quite helpful. Dangerous Calling That's a very honest book. There's a slightly older book called Going the Distance by, I can't remember what his first name is, but the surname is Brain. Not entirely sure that's in print anymore. But that's really sort of helps you think through some of the stresses and pressures, and it's the sort of thing, give that to your fellow elders or your deacons board to get some of them to read them as well. Those are quite helpful books. There's another older book, which a book called Honourably Wounded by Marjorie Foyle, and that's really looking at missionaries. So she was involved in missionary care, and so she's got a medical and counselling background, and that's full of good advice, which I think missionaries have very, again, sort of specific stresses and strains, but some of that overlaps with ministry, whether it's mission or pastoral. And then another great book is Piper's Brothers, We're Not Professionals, which I always think is a slightly ironic title, because of course he's extraordinarily professional and his whole operation is run beautifully professionally. But actually he wants to make the point that that's not the heart of it. That's there are more important things than just having a well-oiled machine, and that's a good book.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Paul, not just for this conversation, but the previous two we've had together. We really appreciate you joining us here on the Reformation Fellowship Podcast.
It's a pleasure, and may the Lord bless Reformation Fellowship and the people listening to this. We have a great God and a wonderful Saviour, and that's kind of the last thing I want to say to you.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today on the Reformation Fellowship Podcast. We would love to stay in touch with you. The best way to do that would be to head over to reffellowship.org. That is refellowship.org. Sign up for our newsletter. We'll be able to keep you updated on upcoming events, upcoming resources, upcoming gatherings, etc. Thank you again for joining us here on the Reformation Fellowship Podcast. God bless.